Everyone. Today I want to dive into a topic, pretty fascinating one, but it is on organizational power and politics. Now, it is important to understand this in the workplace because power dynamics really shape everything. So, from how decisions are made to employee motivation, job satisfaction, stress levels, and even turnover. So, understanding them isn't just essential, but it's even more so if you are an aspiring leader or manager. Some of the things that I'll go through today and cover are things like power bases. So, this is what different types of power actually exist in organizations, as well as counterpower and strategic contingencies. So, this is where or how individuals or teams can really push back, influence relationships, and create some balance. Political behavior is another one. So, what it looks like when people use influence, whether that's intentional or unintentional to get things done. And then ethical considerations, of course, but why it's critical to really spot and curb unethical political behavior before it ruins the company culture, right? Erodes trust and morale. So I would encourage you to really think about your own workplace if you're in a job right now or even an organization that you've been a part of, right? You may have experienced departments that are forming cliques, maybe projects that have been held hostage for things like resource control, right? Maybe leaders leveraging influence behind closed doors. These are just everyday examples of power and politics that are in action. And my goal is to really help you recognize, navigate, and negotiate some of these dynamics, not only effectively, but ethically as well. So now that I've kind of outlined why power matters in organizations, I want to start with the foundation. And that is how power actually works between people. And this is called power in interpersonal relations. And I want to break down what that means and how it plays out in everyday work life. So when we talk about power, it's not just about titles or authority. Yes, that's a part of it, but that's not all of it. It's actually fundamentally about influence, right? Which is the ability to shape another person's behavior in a way they otherwise wouldn't act. So you can look and compare the power of to a car battery. Compare power to a car battery. It has potential, but it doesn't do anything until it's connected through influence to others. So I want to explore, I mentioned power bases, and I want to explore 5 foundational bases of power that really make some of these connections possible. The first type of power is legitimate power. And legitimate power comes from the position or the title. So, for example, when your department manager tells you to submit a report by Friday, you do it. And you do it not just because they've asked, but because the roles or that role really carries recognized authority. The second type of power is reward power. And this is based on your ability to give benefits. So, an example could be, think of a team or think of a team lead. We'll think of a team lead who can really approve extra vacation days or bonuses, right? People comply because there's a reward on the line. So that is reward power. The third type is coercive power. And this stems from the ability to punish or withhold benefits. So imagine a manager that's threatening reassignment or even threatening maybe negative performance reviews. Compliance will follow oftentimes from those individuals, but often under duress and extreme stress. The fourth type of power is expert power, and this really arises from your knowledge or skill. Um, if you think of an IT guy, right? The IT guy or IT girl always gets pulled into some of these crisis calls. Their advice carries weight, and it carries weight because people trust their expertise. So that is expert power. And then there's referent power, and that really comes from respect or admiration. So think of the coworker who's friendly, who's supportive. People may gravitate toward that, right? Even if they're not a formal leader. Now, interestingly, how people respond to being influenced varies. And that's part of, right, organizational behavior is we're all unique individuals and coming into the workplace with our own experiences, our own attitudes and perceptions about work. But sometimes people respond with commitment, right? That is when there's internal buy-in. And then other times it is purely out of compliance. They may do what's asked, but they may not believe in it. Or there are people that may even resist. And that resistance may especially be true if the power feels like it's coercive or maybe illegitimate. So, taking kind of a real world example of what expert power is, because I want to separate expert power from referent power. But for expert power, let's say at a tech startup company, the lead developer of that tech is not the CEO, right? But when he or she says to change the product roadmap because maybe we're getting new user data, the whole team will follow. And that's because they respect this person's technical judgment, right? Their expertise in this area. Referent power, in contrast, let's say you are the culture champion in the office, right? You might not be a manager, but when you propose maybe a team building activity, everyone signs up because they trust you, and they want to support that initiative. So both wield influence for sure without formal authority, just by virtue of what they bring to the table. So, to wrap this up, understanding these bases really helps us to see how influence spreads in teams and organizations, whether it's built on authority, trust, expertise, or in some cases, even fear. So now that I've unraveled how power works and the interpersonal dynamics through these different power bases, I want to shift our focus to the actions people and leaders take to exercise that power. And this brings us to the next topic, which is uses of power. And this is essentially where influence becomes the strategy. Now, there are three parts that this can be organized into. There are the common power tactics, there's symbols of managerial power, and then the ethical use of power. So I want to unpack some commonly used tactics that maybe you've actually observed in organizations you've been a part of, or maybe you will in the future. So common power tactics in organizations. The first one, and we see this actually quite a bit, is controlling access to information. Now, information is power in the workplace. And in a lot of companies, things like maybe knowing the strategic plans, maybe knowing the salaries of others, that oftentimes is limited to people maybe in HR or to top leadership. And that secrecy actually shapes decisions like pay raises or promotions. And it's a powerful tactic because when you limit the information, oftentimes you're influencing the outcome. So think of a scenario where maybe only the C-suite knows about an upcoming merger, right? That places those leaders in control because decisions are driven by who knows what and when. The second type of common power tactics in organizations is controlling access to persons. So, who sees the leader often controls the narrative. Okay. Now, President Nixon, part of President Nixon's downfall was partly tied to his isolation, right? His inner circle managed who had access. The same can happen when managers end up deciding to gatekeep access to things like executives. So, imagine a startup that's surrounded by just one or two advisors. Okay, so keeping others out of tight loops, that is controlling power via selective relationships, and that's what it means when we say controlling access to persons. The third type of power tactic is selective use of objective criteria. So not all performance metrics are created equal. Groups can set criteria that favor certain people, maybe like focusing on publication counts in one department versus maybe teaching quality in another. That subtly, what ends up happening is it tilts hiring, it can tilt promotion decisions and things like that. So if you think of maybe academia, a department that's enamored with research may prioritize published papers over teaching awards, right? Shaping faculty evaluations to their advantage. That is very common. Controlling the agenda is another common type of power tactic. So if a topic never makes it onto the meeting agenda, it's an easy win for someone who's looking to avoid debate, right? Sometimes it's placed last or maybe even drowned out by objections until it's postponed indefinitely. So controlling the agenda is very, very common in the organization, and I've experienced that myself personally. And then the fifth one is, maybe using outside experts. So calling in outside consultants can actually tip the scales quite a bit in organizations, especially when they support a department's case. If, research values are being debated, bringing in an expert panel can strengthen that argument. So, real world example, if IT wants more budget, they may bring in cybersecurity specialists to testify, right? That outside credibility may actually help lobby for resources for the IT department. So there is kind of skin in the game, as you can say. Now, while all of these are common tactics and powerful tools, they aren't always ethical. So, in the next part, I want to look at how these tactics can be misused and, what symbols of managerial power often support them. Like things like the executive corner offices or reserved parking spots. And then I want to focus on how to employ influence with ethics kind of intact. Now, these tactics also reveal how power is actively used and not just held. Okay, so um, this next section is going to be on political behavior in organizations. Let's see what that looks like. Let's see why that matters. Now, politics, according to your text, are actually defined as the activities people take within an organization to acquire, to develop, or use power and resources to get preferred outcomes, especially when there's uncertainty or there's disagreement about choices. Now, think of politics as power in action, right? Power is the potential to influence. Politics is how you actually do it. And that can be done through negotiation, it could be done through coalition building, or even positioning yourself to shape those outcomes. Now, political behavior tends to peak under certain conditions. The first one could be under ambiguous goals. So, when an organization isn't clear on what success looks like, okay? If that's the case, you may see political behavior peak under that condition. Another one is for scarce resources like tight budgets or limited project slots. A third is complex environments or maybe non-routine decisions, and that's where no playbook exists. And then organizational change, so things like restructures or leadership shifts. And, I will say that, research shows that the most politically charged decisions often involve one, interdepartmental coordination, two, promotions and transfers, three, delegation of authority, especially when the rules are vague. Meanwhile, decisions like hiring, maybe establishing personnel policies or disciplinary actions where there are clear rules that exist, maybe it's written down in a policy somewhere, those are far less political. It's those gray areas that we want to look at. So, why is it key to understand politics in the workplace? Politics happens sometimes for good, right? Managers often use political behavior to push outdated policies aside or maybe innovate against resistance, but it can also be divisive. So, knowing the landscape really will help you to navigate it wisely and ethically. Now, that's politics at play, right? How different groups jockey for influence when uncertainty or competition is present. Now that I've mapped out how politics plays out in organizations, why it happens, where it shows up, it's really time to shift our focus to solutions. So how can leaders push back against unhealthy, political dynamics, and create a culture where influence is used ethically? So let's explore kind of maybe limiting the influence of political behavior. Now, the truth is you cannot completely eliminate politics, but you can manage some of the harmful effects that may come with it. And so your text actually lays out four powerful strategies to reduce inappropriate or unethical political behavior. Um, so ambiguity is one example, right? It creates a breeding ground for politics. And one effective strategy is to clarify job roles, clarify performance expectations, and maybe reward criteria, right? Maybe clearly defining all of this. So when employees know what's expected and how they're being evaluated, there is less room for manipulation. Fostering collaboration is another thing that we can do, right? So if we can foster collaboration instead of competition, it will help dampen political infighting. And this means that using fair standards for resource allocation and emphasizing maybe shared company goals. Now, when certain individuals or teams decide to hoard power, it actually will breed territory-based silos. And this is very common in companies, especially in organizations that run a little bit more flat and aren't as hierarchical. Now, leaders can disrupt that by maybe rotating people. maybe restructuring roles or adjusting some of those reward systems to promote more of the cross-functional collaboration. Culture matters, right? So building these long-term safeguards really start with training, smart promotion practices, and rewards that are going to favor cooperation over competition. And if you can apply these four strategies, organizations won't just curb some of those toxic politics, but they'll really build systems that promote fairness, right? And clarity and unity. So, as we wrap up this chapter, I want to kind of do a little bit of a recap of what we've learned today. So, we began by exploring power and interpersonal relations and how influence really flows through legitimate authority, rewards, coercion, expertise, and even personal connection. And we saw that power isn't just about titles, but really it's about the ability to affect the outcomes. From there, we looked at the different uses of power, the tactics and the strategies that leaders and employees are employing, from controlling information to maybe shaping agendas, and how those actions can be used ethically or unethically. And then we stepped into the world of political behavior. So, where power moves into action, especially in situations of uncertainty, scarce resources, or even competing priorities. And we acknowledge that politics can be both a tool for positive change, but it can also be a source of serious tension in the organization, depending on how it's wielded. And then finally, examine some ways to limit the influence of harmful political behavior. So reducing system uncertainty, fostering collaboration, you know, preventing them from forming in the future. These strategies aren't just about controlling behavior, but they're about creating a culture of fairness, a culture of transparency, and shared purpose. Now, I mentioned in the beginning, and I'll wrap up with this here at the end, that power and politics are inevitable in any organization, but how we use them really determines whether they become a force for progress or a barrier to trust and teamwork. And leaders who can understand these dynamics can navigate them with wisdom, integrity, and a commitment to the greater good. So take a moment to reflect. Again, think about your own workplace or an organization that you've been a part of. What is one example where power was used in a way that built trust and collaboration? And always go back to that. Look at your values. We've talked about that too in prior videos. And if you can do that, you'll definitely be able to lead with influence. Thank you.